About a week ago, I switched back to my Intel-based 16-inch MacBook Pro after a week with the M1 equipped 13-inch MacBook Pro. The first thing that I did was to clean up the edit from my M1 MacBook Pro experience video, and I have to say, hearing the speakers on my 16-inch for the first time in a week felt so good. The speakers on the machine just sound so full and the screen felt so big and roomy coming from a 13-inch screen. But that whole moment lasted about 10 minutes as it was abruptly interrupted by the noise of the fans ramping up and the fact that my lap was beginning to feel warm. Then I thought to myself, damn, I really missed the silent operation of the M1 13-inch MacBook Pro. This machine was just like silent and it never really got warm to my lap. Which leads me to the question of this video, do I regret buying the 16-inch MacBook Pro? So in today's video, I want to circle back to some of the Apple Silicon concerns that I raised when I bought the 16-inch MacBook Pro video a few months back. In that video, I talked extensively about why I didn't just wait a little longer to get a machine like this with the Apple M1 chip or an Apple Silicon chip. And I have quite a few things to say now that I have had some time to use the Apple M1 chip on this 13-inch MacBook Pro for my workflow of content creation and web development. I'm going to start off with the price to performance ratio between both machines. The 13-inch MacBook Pro that I have here has the Apple M1 chip, 16GB of unified memory, 256GB of SSD storage, and costs $1,500 on the Apple website. My 16-inch MacBook Pro, in the other hand, is spec'd out with a 2.4GHz Core i9 processor, 32GB of DDR4 memory, 2TB of SSD storage, AMD 5500M graphics, and costs a whopping $3,900. That's like 2.5 times more expensive, so that means like my 16-inch MacBook Pro is like 2.5 times faster than this M1 chip on this 13-inch MacBook Pro, right? Well, in a lot of cases, no. In my experience, the Core i9 processor and the Apple M1 chip perform the same with my day-to-day computing activities like web browsing with Chrome, writing notes with Notion, and coding on Visual Studio Code. The only place I can see a noticeable difference in terms of real performance numbers is with rendering clips on DaVinci Resolve. On average, the 5500M graphics on my 16-inch MacBook Pro renders video clips 2 times faster than the 8-core integrated graphics on this Apple M1 chip on this 13-inch MacBook Pro. This isn't a fair comparison per se, as the 5500M graphics is a dedicated GPU that has its own pool of 8GB of video memory, whereas the graphics on the Apple M1 chip has to share its memory with other things in the Apple M1 chip. And speaking of memory, I'm very surprised that the 16GB of unified memory was sufficient for my multitasking needs. Ever since I got my 16-inch MacBook Pro with 32GB of RAM, I've gotten used to just leaving apps open. More specifically, I just end up leaving a bunch of Chrome tabs open because why not? I have 32GB of RAM to spare. When I mirrored the same behavior on this 13-inch MacBook Pro with the Apple M1 chip, it behaved well, apps continued to be snappy even while multitasking, and more importantly, I didn't notice any slowdowns due to the number of things that I had running on the background. I guess the unified memory architecture that Apple built into the M1 chip does have its advantage of being able to more quickly and more efficiently swap out processes in and out of memory when it's required to do so. That said, I still stand by my mindset of having more RAM than I would need, especially given that these machines don't feature user upgradable memory, and unlike SSD space, I can't just plug in something on the USB-C port and add more RAM like I would plug in an external SSD to get more storage on the machine. But going back to this whole pricing thing, one point that I made in my previous video was that this new generation of Apple Silicon Macs would retain Apple's hardware upgrade pricing scheme, and I was correct. The memory and storage upgrade prices are the same on this M1 equipped MacBook Pro compared to my Intel-based 16-inch MacBook Pro. In short, I feel that the price to performance ratio of my 16-inch MacBook Pro compared to the M1 equipped 13-inch MacBook Pro that I have here is okay. My 16-inch MacBook Pro excels in the performance metric that I care about, which is rendering videos, and it also has better hardware traits like a bigger 16-inch screen, better speakers, and also 2 extra USB-C ports on the right-hand side of the device. Like one of the things that I did not like about the M1 MacBook Pro was that the USB-C ports are on the left side and the 3.5mm jack are on the right side. Why couldn't they just put all the ports on one side of the device? Adding to that, over the years I've gotten used to plugging in my laptops on the right hand side, and this device does not have its power port on the right hand side. Felt a little disorienting to me. Also, as a lefty, I use my mouse on the left side, and it's quite annoying to do so when I have to plug in an SD card reader, SSD, or just the power adapter being plugged into the left side of the device and using my mouse there. And speaking of powering options of this device, I'm really very impressed with the battery life or the endurance on this 13-inch MacBook Pro with the Apple M1 chip. It just sips through battery even when I'm using apps like Google Chrome and DaVinci Resolve. And when I switched back to the 16-inch MacBook Pro, the thing that caught my eye after the fan started ramping up was the battery percentage. It was going down so fast relative to what I've been experiencing the previous week, where I could be using the computer for like 30 minutes just doing a lot of things, and the battery percentage would just go down by 1 or 2%. Undoubtedly, the battery performance on this M1 MacBook Pro here contributed most to my feeling of buyer's remorse for the 16-inch MacBook Pro, because the endurance on this machine is just so good. Apple has just made a lot of engineering trades with the M1 chip to make it very efficient on macOS. But despite that, I still feel that my decision to get the 16-inch MacBook Pro a few months back was the right call to make. I do wish that my 16-inch MacBook Pro would have the instant wake feature like this M1 MacBook Pro, but as is, I'm happy with the performance of my 16-inch MacBook Pro. I'm confident that it's able to perform well with anything that I throw at it. That's not something that I can confidently say with the M1 MacBook Pro. Sure, I have previously shown that the apps that I use on a day-to-day basis perform well on this machine, but I haven't yet been able to try out anything that I wouldn't normally do on this M1 chip. After the initial hiccup that I had while trying to get my software development environment set up on this M1 equipped MacBook Pro, I kind of feel like maybe it's good to wait out a little bit longer for everything to be properly ported over to Apple Silicon before making a transition, especially given that I'm constantly learning new things in the software development space, and I would rather have the peace of mind to learn something new on a tried and true platform like an Intel MacBook Pro, where issues and workarounds are properly documented on the internet, versus having to innovate myself through an error or bug if I do come across one. The bottom line here is that with technology, there's always something new just around the corner. And if I did choose to wait out a few more months before buying my 16-inch MacBook Pro, I might have honestly convinced myself to wait until mid-2021 or even later for the M1X chip or the next generation Apple Silicon chip that is more powerful or better. It's just going to be a never-ending cycle of waiting for the next big thing. Furthermore, the Apple M1 chip on this 13-inch MacBook Pro is still an entry-level chip in terms of where it sits on Apple's eventual hierarchy of Apple Silicon chips, and not to mention, there's nothing too remarkable about the hardware on this machine. The webcam is still 720p and the bezels are still a bit too thick for 2021. This is probably the last of this design we'll see from Apple. I'm crossing my fingers for a 14-inch MacBook Pro with Face ID. Using this 13-inch MacBook Pro for the past 2 weeks have kind of reminded me how much I liked the portability of a small screen laptop. I did spend 3 years of my undergrad using the 12.3-inch screen on my Microsoft Surface Pro 4 as my daily driver. When it's time for me to upgrade again in the next few years, I'll probably choose to get a smaller screen laptop, as by then, I believe the thermal performance of CPU and GPUs for small screen devices will be more performant, given that Apple has essentially given the chip-making industry a wake-up call now that they have started unleashing Apple Silicon, which are like really powerful. That is all that I have to say about this video. If you have any thoughts or questions, feel free to leave them in the comments section and I'll be sure to get them answered for you. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like on this video and smash the subscribe button and toggle the bell icon so you can be notified on future video releases. Thanks for watching and I hope to see you in the next video.